and also the Prince William County Human Rights Commission, and again, the support of in-kind services of the Northern Virginia Legal Services, or should I say Legal Services of Northern Virginia. At this time, I'm going to introduce someone who needs no introduction. Past chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, the Honorable Congressman Jerry Conley.
Well, good afternoon. It's so great to be here with you today and to be with a great United States Senator who would have made a great United States Vice President. There's also my dear friend Sharon Bulova, who Kate Hanley and I love to say is one of the 3 best chairmen in the history of the county. I wanted to say she's the best, but Kate gets touchy about it. Anyways, we're talking about housing. And as somebody, my generation, 1968 was the most indelibly imprinted year in our lives. It started with such hope. We were going to end the war. We were going to elect a new president who was going to do that and unify the country. Black and white, poor and rich, rural and urban. And we actually had hoped it could be done. And then we saw Martin Luther King killed in April. And then we saw Bobby Kennedy killed in June. We had seen the Tet Offensive in February of that year that completely unraveled the rationale for the Vietnam War and the myth that we were winning, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. And one bright spot was the Fair Housing Act. And because we were striking a blow for the civil rights movement and for equality in America. And the fight was very hard. It was a very highly filibustered bill. People forget that in the 60s, federal manuals talked about how to protect neighborhoods and keep them all white. In the New Deal, the precursor to HUD talked about housing developments that would be protected, meaning racially. These were in federal documents. There were federal contracts that if you were going to get a federal loan or grant, you had to agree to keep it racially segregated. I remember when I went to college, there was still in the suburbs of Chicago ordinances in the suburbs that precluded certain people from ever moving into those suburbs or selling a home to somebody who didn't look like you. We've come a long way. But the fight ain't over yet. Last year there were at least 2 million formal racial discrimination complaints filed under fair housing in America. And that probably masks how many there really are. And in the current climate, an awful lot of voices that would love to add to racial discrimination, who want to argue for one racist supremacy over all others, have been emboldened. Right here in Virginia, we saw it in Charlottesville last summer. And not everybody, even in 2017, had the moral clarity to say that is wrong. That's ancient history, and we won't put up with it. It's not who we are anymore. It's not what our value system tells us is the right thing to do. So, we still have work to do. We still need the Fair Housing Act more than ever before. So as we celebrate 50 years, we also have to rededicate ourselves to the mission. Understanding our work is far from done. But also understanding that even in tough times, battles can be won and need to be fought for by good people who want to change their communities, who want to make sure we stay on the path of righteousness, and that all Americans will be included in what opportunities we create, that all Americans will feel welcome and never feel the pang of discrimination. That's our goal. That's the proposition to which we're dedicated. And that's why we're here celebrating the 50th anniversary today. With that, let me introduce one of the 3 best chairmen in the history of Fairfax County, who is a passionate advocate for what I just was preaching, and practices what she preaches every day in making sure Fairfax is a welcoming community, a diverse community, a caring community. Sharon Bullock.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I drove here from Prince William County and walked in this room a little bit late. And for a minute, I thought I had come into the wrong room because it was so full of noise and laughter. What a great crowd. I love it that we are here with so much enthusiasm, and I want to thank you for your enthusiasm. I also want to say this is like my worst nightmare, to be speaking between 2 great speakers, Jerry Connolly and Senator Tim Kaine. They are the best. So thank you. It's an honor to be here with you today to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And while we celebrate, and this really is kind of the theme of what I heard from Jerry and what we'll be talking about today, while we are celebrating how far we've come, it's important that we dedicate the time and continued work towards continuing education and training, because there is still more to be done. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Tim Kaine, I would like to recognize some of my colleagues who are here today. I'm not sure if they've been recognized already, but Supervisor Penny Gross, I think, is here somewhere. Yeah. There's Penny. Supervisor Kathy Smith. Welcome, Kathy. Supervisor Jeff McKay. And Supervisor Kathy Hudgens. And if there is anyone else who slipped in who I did not recognize, any of my colleagues, this is convenient because we are all close to the government center in this location, and our next stop is to the Fairfax County Government Center, and we're going to be working on our last meeting before we mark up our budget on Tuesday. So, and in that budget, within that budget, is funding to continue some programs like Diversion First, One Fairfax, making sure that we have opportunity and equity for everyone who is a Fairfax County resident. This is truly a partnership, and so we can't do anything as just government. And it's important, especially in Fairfax County, where we have a unique culture of working with the private sector. So this is a partnership which features public, private, and importantly, nonprofit sectors. I want to thank you to Fairfax County's Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs, along with the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, the Prince William Human Rights Commission, Northern Virginia Legal Services, and all major co-sponsors. In addition, thank you to representatives from all across the region who have joined us here today. It's gratifying to know that many of you are already doing great things in the area of housing, both in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. You are on the front lines, helping to combat housing discrimination and helping to secure housing for our vulnerable populations. We commend you for your dedication and for your commitment to serving others in need of an ally. It's now my honor to introduce Senator Tim Kaine, a lifelong fighter and advocate for fair housing, as well as so many other things. Senator Kaine is truly a wonderful, wonderful partner. After law school, he practiced law in Richmond for 17 years, specializing in the representation of people who had been denied housing due to their race or their disability. He litigated many important cases and remains a strong proponent of fair housing rights and a great partner. Welcome, Senator Tim Kaine.
Hey guys, how's everybody doing today? I echo what Sharon said. When I came in, I thought it was like a rock concert or something. Everybody was so pumped, and it's because the cause is so powerful. My friend Governor Wilder always said, when the thing is right, the time is right. Fair housing is right. It was right in 1968. It's right in 2018. We will lead the Fair Housing Act in 2068. But I'm very happy to be asked to come and join in together with you on this 50th anniversary this month of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and to offer some reflections that are both very personal but also big picture policy challenges that are ahead. Let me start with some thanks. I want to thank the Office of Human Rights and Equity Programs, to Ken, to you and all of your team. Thank you so much. Give a round of applause to Fairfax. Sharon is a good friend. We've known each other a long time. Jerry, Sharon told me you talked her into running for the Board of Supervisors. You told her how easy it would be, and that she has never been able to believe anything you've said ever since. But she is a tremendous elected official.
I lied, but that's in these days.
If people weren't naive, they would never accept tough responsibility. So God bless naivete, but Sharon, you've done a wonderful job. And to you and all of your colleagues on the board, Fairfax's board has a well-deserved reputation for good government, for progressive government. So thank you all for your service. Thank you for being here. Jerry is a dear friend. Jerry and I met because we were both in local government. I was a city councilman and then mayor, and Jerry was on the Board of Supervisors and then chair, and we developed a wonderful friendship of local government and Catholic theology. And Irish stuff. And those kind of unify as the eternal hat trick. But Jerry and I have been wonderful friends, and he's a great partner in Congress. The Virginia legislative delegation, I'll tell you a little bit about us. We do something that would seem so obvious. Any of you would do this, but most states don't. Once a month, all of the Virginia delegation, the House members and the two senators, have lunch together to talk about what can we do to help our state. There's plenty of issues where we don't agree on, but there's plenty of issues where we do, and we try to focus on those issues where we can work together. And those monthly meetings and just the partnership we forge House and Senate means a lot, Jerry. Thank you so much for your leadership. There's a whole lot of other people here who are important and deserve recognition, but I just wanted to especially acknowledge the folks who are here from HUD, because we've got Joe DeFelice, who's the regional administrator of HUD Region 3 in Philadelphia. And Marvin Turney, who's the director of the National Capital Region for HUD. HUD is the lead federal agency over the Fair Housing Act, together with the Department of Justice, which often works on enforcement activities. And I certainly know from my time, 17 years doing fair housing work, the work only really gets done when HUD is really leaning into it. A lot of the work can be done by dedicated cities, dedicated counties, dedicated fair housing organizations. You'll hear from some of my friends in the Fair Housing Organization Committee on panels this afternoon, dedicated lawyers in private practice. You'll hear from some of them too. But the best advocacy by everybody can't really do the job if you don't have a HUD that takes it seriously and really leans in. And so I really appreciate the HUD representation today, and I know that they'll be on panels later and talk about this. It's important to do this in Fairfax. It's important to do this in Fairfax. Diverse community, successful community, imperfect community, like every community. Fairfax is a community that has all kinds of challenges that you struggle with in government every day, just like I did when I was on the City Council, Mayor of Richmond. There's no community in Virginia or anywhere that can't be better tomorrow than we are today. That's why you have a hearing like this. That's why you have a symposium like this. We can be better tomorrow than we are today. We'll learn from each other today about how to be better. But Fairfax also has an interesting place in the history of the fair housing movement because of Reston. And I'm a real Fairfaxer could give you 10 or 15 stories, but even a Richmonder who does fair housing work knows about Reston. The Fair Housing Act was passed by Congress in April of 1968. Virginia was the first southern state to pass a fair housing law in 1971. But Reston was one of the first communities built in the United States 4 years before the Fair Housing Act passed, with a specific design to not only have an income mix in the community and a commercial and residential mix in the community, but also specifically built with the goal of being integrated. That seems obvious now. That's what's required now. But in 1964, that wasn't so obvious. There was some courage and vision about that. And in the fair housing story of the country, communities like Reston that intentionally decided that they wanted to be about integrated housing played a really important role. I haven't seen Kathy yet, but Kathy Hudgens is the Hunter Mill district rep, and she represents Reston as a longtime Reston representative who really knows the history of that community. But that makes it important that Fairfax do this because you played an important role. Last thing I'll say before telling you about my own personal connection and then some challenges that we have today nationally is what Jerry was saying about 1968. 1968 might have been one of the toughest years in my life. I'm 60 years old. I was 10 years old in 1958. I remember the assassination of Martin Luther King like it happened 5 minutes ago. I remember the assassination of Bobby Kennedy like it happened 5 minutes ago. I remember the Vietnam War protests. I remember the disruption of the Chicago Democratic Convention over the Vietnam War and other issues. It was a very tumultuous year in this country. I was a kid growing up in Kansas City, and I didn't know anybody in politics or anything, but I would go out to get the paper in the morning with a sense of dread about what I might read, what I might see on the front page of the paper. And yet there's a lesson there, because although the year was so difficult and challenging, the Fair Housing Law passed. In a difficult and challenging time, some good things can happen. And sometimes they're good things that may take a while to flourish and flower and grow, but I think we're living in a difficult time now. But the lesson of 1968 is, however difficult the time, there's some good things that are happening. There's some good things that can happen if we put our muscle and our energies to them, and maybe especially in a tough time, it's really important to try to find those seeds that we can plant that can, over the course of years, become more and more powerful. That's what the Fair Housing Act did. The Fair Housing Act as passed isn't what it is now. It was a much more limited and narrow set of remedies, much more difficult to access. Over time, Congress has expanded it, and advocates just like you have expanded it in practice, and that's very, very important. Let me tell you how I first became connected to fair housing. I went to Harvard Law School. I graduated. My wife's a better negotiator, so although I'm from Kansas, I ended up a Virginian. And we moved to Richmond in August of 1984, and I passed the bar exam. And so in October, I'm now practicing in a small law firm that had, I think I was the 13th lawyer at the firm. You know what happens at a firm? Somebody will come in with a worthy case who can't pay, and they'll say, who's the newest person in this firm? Who is the youngest, most junior person that we can get to do it? And literally, probably within 2 weeks after finding out that I passed the bar exam, one of the partners at my firm said, well, here's a young client, Lorraine was her name. thinks she's been discriminated against in housing. I wanted to do trial work, but I didn't know necessarily what kind of work I wanted to do. But I sat down across the desk from my first client, that was my client, Lorraine. She was almost exactly my age. This was her story. Just like me, she had just moved to Richmond. Just like me, she was just starting a new job. Now those are big transitions in your life when you're a young person. And for many, certainly for me, those transition moments had some anxieties, but they were also exciting. Starting off a career, coming to a new community. And I had just done that and looked for housing, and so had Lorraine. Lorraine had seen an ad in the newspaper for an apartment in a neighborhood that was convenient to her work. And she wanted to go and possibly rent the apartment, so she called at lunch. I saw the ad. I'd like to come at the end of the day today and take a look at the apartment. Great, please, yeah, come on over. She gets there 4 hours later at the end of the day, talks to the landlord. The landlord says, I'm sorry, the place has already been rented. Something about the interaction did not seem right to her. So when she went back to work the next day, and she saw the ad was still in the paper, she asked a colleague to call. Same thing, I'm interested in renting an apartment. Could I go, oh yeah, please, come on over. The apartment hadn't been rented, but when the landlord saw that Lorraine was African American, she basically said, okay, you're not going to rent in my building. Here is what, it was a slam dunk case. That's always a good case for the youngest lawyer, because I had Lorraine's testimony and I had her colleague's testimony, and they was completely unshakable. So I drafted this up once I researched the fair housing laws. You were turned away for one reason only, because of the color of your skin, to an apartment that was available, filed it, settled the lawsuit quickly, because once the lawyer had a chance to talk to Lorraine and my witness, okay, this was wrong, settled it. But it made a huge impression on me, even though it was a case that we won quickly, and here's why. Two reasons. I could see, Lorraine was just like me, except that she was an African American woman, I was a Caucasian guy. And I had looked for an apartment and it worked out fine. And she had looked for an apartment and been turned away because of the color of her skin. And I realized two things in talking to her. The first one was how important housing is. I don't think physical things are important. Relationships are important. Money's not important. Physical things are not important. But your house is sort of more than a thing. Housing is more than a thing. Housing is an extension of who you are as a person. So it's not like a car, it's not like any other thing. It really is almost an extension of your personality. And I certainly thought about that myself, how excited I was to be having this apartment that I liked, living in a new city. It really was part of it. And as I heard Lorraine express her concern, I realized the same with her. Housing is more important than a thing. It's part of your person. And the second thing I realized about Lorraine in our discussion was this. This experience of being turned away by this landlord was going to affect her every time she looked for housing for the rest of her life. I had an experience where, hey, it worked out fine. So when I had to buy a house 5 years later, I wasn't walking into it worried about, am I going to be treated badly? But if you've had the experience of being discriminated against and it's just crystal clear, the next interaction that you go at, you're going to go into it with a little bit of a concern. There's going to be a little bit of a voice of doubt or question in your mind about, am I going to be treated fairly? And that is such an important thing that I learned. Well, that was my first case, and over the course of now many, many years, 17 years, this was 65% of the cases that I did. I represented people against real estate agencies and against banks and against apartment communities and against homeowners insurance companies. I brought suits against, sorry to say, against local governments sometimes. I brought cases that were not just fair housing cases. Sometimes I would bring a fair housing case and also make it an antitrust case, because real estate firms and banks in a small community would together work to take away somebody's opportunity, and if the entire market is basically shut off to you, then that becomes an antitrust case too. But all along the way, and I had some cases that were, big precedent-setting cases. I won a case that was the largest jury verdict ever in a civil rights case in U.S. history, $100 million jury verdict against Nationwide Insurance for redlining minority neighborhoods. But all along the way, big cases, small, winning some, losing some, trying them, settling them, those two observations from my first client that housing is part of your person, it's not a thing. And that discrimination is not just about what happens today, but it's about the doubt it could then create in your mind for the rest of your life, have really stuck with me. Big picture challenges. We've made a lot of progress, thank goodness. But in other ways, we have so much farther to go. There isn't, in some ways, over the time of my 17 years, some of the just outright, plain on its face discrimination, white supremacy, bigotry. That has not disappeared, but it is reducing. But there's still all kinds of inequalities and discrimination, and people are smart enough often to be able to hide them or make them difficult to understand. And that's why this symposium today and the trainings that you're doing are so important, because we want to learn from today and get better at it. We need a federal housing policy at HUD and FHA that doesn't just defend people when they're under attack, but that advances fair housing goals. I'm going to tell you why, because sadly, for a very long time, the federal government advanced segregation. And the only way you're going to cure the federal government having advanced segregation for many years is to have a federal government that advances, not just defends people, but advances the goal of integration and housing. And that's so very, very important. There's a role for local governments. Local governments, we used to do this when I was mayor, to get CDBG funds and others as a mayor, we would do studies. We would have to do studies that would measure segregation in our city and what steps are we affirmatively taking to break it down. There's a huge role for state and local governments. You'll hear from Michael on Attorney Day, the role of the private lawyers, and Lisa Rice, I think, is going to be here from the National Fair Housing Association. Fair housing organizations and testing and pushing and pushing and pushing is so very important. I think there's a lot of issues that are out there dealing with folks with disabilities that are going to continue to be really, really important that we focus on in housing. And I'm going to tell you that the challenge that I'm working on, or that I'm starting to realize may be one of our biggest challenges right now. There's a lot of angst in this country over wealth and income inequality. And there's been a bunch of research recently to suggest that wealth and income inequality is really driven heavily by housing inequality. In fact, I just encourage you to read this. There's a wonderful writer who used to be at George Mason, Richard Florida, that some of you know. Richard Florida wrote a piece in the last week in City Lab, which is a publication that deals with sort of urban policy. And the article is this: is housing inequality the main driver of economic inequality? And just to tantalize you to read this, came out just in the last week. I'm just going to read you a couple of quotes from this piece, because I think it really points up challenges, and especially challenges in metropolitan areas like the Richmond area in Northern Virginia. Economic inequality is one of the most significant issues facing cities and entire nations today. But a mounting body of research suggests that housing inequality may well be the biggest contributor to our economic divides. Housing now represents a huge share of America's total consumption, comprising roughly 40% of U.S. total capital stock, and 2/3 of the wealth that's held by the middle class. Housing inequality was high in 1930 at the onset of the Depression. It then declined alongside income inequality during the Great Compression and suburban boom of the 1950s and 60s. But it started to creep up again in the 70s. There was a huge spike of housing inequality in the 90s, followed by a leveling off in 2000, but then another significant spike by 2012 in the wake of the recovery from the fiscal crisis. By 2012, the level of housing inequality in the U.S. looked almost exactly as it did in the 1930s. A couple of other quotes that grabbed my attention. This piece is just 1 week old. Housing is at once a basic mode of shelter and a form of investment. As this basic necessity has been transformed over time into a financial instrument and a source of wealth, not only has housing inequality increased, but housing inequality has become a major driver, if not the principal driver, in wealth inequality. When you consider the fact that what is a necessity for everyone has turned into a financial instrument for a few, this is no surprise. The rising housing, last paragraph I'll read, the rising housing inequality brings us face to face with the central paradox of today's increasingly urbanized form of capitalism. The clustering of talent, industry investment, and other economic assets in small parts of cities and metropolitan areas is at once the main engine of economic growth and the biggest driver of inequality. The ability to buy and own housing, much more than income or any other source of wealth, is a significant factor in the growing divides between economy's winners and economy's losers. So the housing issues have become critical, not just because we want people to be treated equally in housing. That's an important enough rationale. That's what the Fair Housing Act says. We got to keep at it. Housing inequality now is one of the main, if not the main driver in income inequality in our communities, in our nation, and in nations around the world. And if that doesn't call for bright minds to think of new creative solutions, new creative housing policies, nothing does. You're going to have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Started off by the lunch that will begin as soon as I stop speaking. and so what I would like to just do again is just say thank you for the opportunity to come and be with you today. And I just want to encourage you to be at this work. We need this law, and we need dedicated practitioners and local government officials and fair housing organization leaders and everyday citizens to push the importance of the law and be creative in enforcing it. We need it as much as we did in 1968. Thanks for inviting me, and good luck in your work.
How about this? Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.
I like that. Is this on? Once again, I'd like to thank Senator Tim Kaine for coming today. My pleasure. And next, every year we always do a very good job of this. It's the lunch portion, so I'd like for tables 1, 2, 3, and 4. For those of you that are staying, you guys can get in line now. And then we'll call other tables. There are 4 lines. Each line has the same food.